All right, welcome back, everybody. We're in our second week back from spring break now. I picked a terrible time to start recording because my daughter is getting her diaper changed, and sometimes she gets very mad about that. So if you hear a screaming baby in the background, yeah, that's that. So only a really quick update this time. As things progress, we're getting more information from the district about like grading and approaching stuff and everything. I was worried for a little bit that they were going to make me put the due date for things as Thursday, but I have confirmed that I can still put it as Friday, so we're good there. Um, May 20th is the last day we can have things due for you guys. So in theory, after May 20th, you guys should be done in all your classes, because that includes finals as well. It's not like May 20th and then finals. It's May 20th is the last day we could assign stuff. Which means we need to alter what we're covering in this class, because after World War I, which should be wrapping up towards the end of next week, we still have to do the rise of dictators and World War II. Don't have time for that in like the 2.5, 3 weeks we'll have after we finish World War I. So as a group, the World Studies teachers decided that it makes more sense to kind of skip over the rise of the dictators stuff, because we could talk about that a little bit during World War II, and then we'll just we'll cover World War II. And that's unfortunately all we're going to be able to do. It's a bummer. We don't get to talk about like the rise of Hitler and the rise of Mussolini. We don't get to talk about like Japan and their militarism. It's definitely not ideal in any way. It's, I think, some of the cooler stuff to talk about, but we just time limits. If May 20th is the last day we can give you stuff, we can't cover everything we wanted to cover. So that being said, this is probably the biggest PowerPoint I do in the entire year. It is a longer one, so definitely feel free, since it's a recording, a video, break this thing up. Do like half of it at one time, like come back later, do the other half. You'll be good to go. But this is Weapons and Tactics of World War I. I get to talk to you guys about some gross feat and stuff like that. You might notice that the notes page for this one is a little bit organized differently. It's the same as the actual PowerPoint itself here. So you're going to give me the information about the thing, the tactic, or the weapon, and then you're going to tell me what the effects of that would be in the other column. So the first thing we have is trenches. This is obviously not a weapon. You don't have weaponized trenches. But World War I, especially on the Western Front, is characterized by trench warfare. It is like the trench warfare war that has been fought in the world. And it has a huge influence on how the war is fought and really how it affects people. This is primarily, like I said, the Western Front response of they hunker down. They're trying to get into defensive areas, so they dig out trenches, and that's just how the war develops. These trenches are super cramped. They're muddy. You can see this thing right here. That's a trench. It's literally just a hole in the ground. This is more of a frontline trench. It's not very well developed. Some of them would actually have like wooden walls put up with like wooden walkways, but a lot of them were just dirt holes in the ground. And when it rains, what happens? All the dirt overflows. Or not all the dirt. All the rain overflows. You get mud. It's all like gross and filled up. Keep in mind they also have to have latrines, places people go to the bathroom. Those are usually dug off to the side. So when the rain really overflows everything, guess what fills up your trench? Yeah, you'd sit there with the nice, muddy, gross water. So, yeah, I mean, this keeps you safe from enemy fire, but it brings a host of other problems, mostly sanitary issues, and the idea of, like, you can't really stay dry and clean in there. You've got to deal with overflowing sewage. You've got to deal with water all the time. And as we'll talk about in just a minute here, when your feet are wet all the time, anybody stayed in the shower or the bath too long and you get like those pruny, wrinkly hands sort of stuff going on, or feet, that's the early stages of something that can get really bad. There's also the idea of this lack of sanitation brings in a lot of really gross stuff, like rats, for example. There are reports from World War I of these rats running around the trenches that got to be the size of like small to medium-sized cats. Just giant rats just running around eating everything they could. Keeps you safe, does not keep you happy. So what is the effect of this kind of living going to be? Because that's where you are the whole time. Well, gross feet pictures have started. Close quarters lead to a lot of disease, and things like trench foot. So that wrinkly, pruny hands thing is actually the early stages of what will eventually become a flesh-eating bacteria and the decay of your flesh, because your skin is not supposed to be wet all the time. When that happens, that starts causing issues, especially if your skin is wet in a dark enclosed area, like, I don't know, a boot or something. And as a soldier, how often are you going to be able to take off your boot? You could be attacked at any time. You can't take your boots off. You got to leave those things on pretty much all the time. So then your feet start basically decaying. That encourages the growth of fungus and bacteria, and that fungus starts to eat away. You start getting gangrene. You start getting what is sometimes referred to as jungle rot, especially when you get it in warmer climates. Trench foot eats away at the skin on your foot and eventually your legs, and it could actually cause some really severe issues up to and including amputation. Your feet start to swell and expand outwards. So when it's in a boot, you would get to the point where, like, they couldn't even pull boots off of these people. They would actually have to cut the boot off because their foot was so swollen. They couldn't pull the boot off. It had swollen to the point where it was basically just stuck on them. So you have horrible disease issues like that. Plus, like, all the normal, you got a bunch of people crammed into a small area when it's rainy and wet and cold. There's going to be just, normal like colds. The Spanish flu goes on during World War I, which is like the coronavirus, but actually, if you can believe it, even worse. And millions and millions and millions of people are going to die of the Spanish flu. That's going to have all kinds of health problems there. On top of that, trench warfare, it does its job. It's a very defensible position, which means that the war is going to take way longer because it's just going to be a stalemate of back and forth fighting. This is also then going to influence a lot of the other military technology we talk about, because people are going to start building things to deal with trenches. I hope you're not eating or about to eat anything right now, because the next picture has even grosser foot pictures. The next slide, I should say. So if you don't want to see really gross foot pictures, just look away for a minute. So this is more advanced trench foot. You can see here that fungal infection I was talking about. That skin is eaten away on his heel there. That's actually his bone right there. You can see right here as well. You can see into the bones there. That guy is probably losing both of his feet at this point. And if he doesn't, he's at least losing these parts of it, because they have to cut that stuff out. You can't really get rid of it, especially with that medical technology they had back then. Really severe cases actually even eats away down to the bone. Like, you can see this guy's toes have completely rotted off. So yeah, amputation, loss of limbs and extremities is a very possible outcome of trench foot if it's not treated properly, which it often wasn't. All right, you can look back again if you were looking away. There's no more gross feet for the rest of the PowerPoint. So next thing is machine guns. These are not invented really for World War I, but they are improved during World War I, and they're used extensively. When we are talking about machine guns here, if you play like FPSs, you watch action movies, and people are running around with like dual machine guns and they're firing all over the place, that is not the kind of machine gun we're talking about here. We are talking about a large field gun, like you can see right here. It is incredibly heavy. You cannot operate it with one person. In fact, even the small ones need 4 to 6 people on it. You need somebody firing it. You need somebody stabilizing it. You need somebody feeding in the bullets. You need an engineer/technician there to deal with it if it jams or anything. The really big ones actually need up to 12 people to work them because they're giant. These are not mobile weapons, but that does mean that you can use them to fortify areas really well, because you can just put them in a fortified area, and then when people try to attack you, you just mow them down. And what do trenches give you? An easy, fortified, stationary area to set up machine guns. So when we combine trenches and machine guns and these awesome face masks they get to wear to protect against stuff we'll talk about later, what do you get? Well, you get a lot of dead people. Oh no, it cut off a little bit. That's okay. It just says comfortable right there, so we're good. You end up with this area called no man's land. And this is not just a result of machine guns. It's also a result of like landmines and barbed wire and artillery. But basically you have 2 trenches, and in between them is an area that ends up looking like this because it has been absolutely decimated by artillery fire and machine gun fire and flamethrowers and landmines and all this other stuff. And basically, if you go out here, there is a good chance you're going to die. That's why it's called no man's land. You more or less stay in your trench until it's time to attack, and then you have to run across no man's land, which sucks. And if you're one of the first people up and over the trench and into no man's land, you're not having a very high chance of living through that. So that is going to be an extremely difficult area to deal with. And again, those trenches, not really comfortable places, but when you compare it to this, it looks a little bit more comfortable. Next up, we got poison gas. This is a brand new thing during World War I. It is invented by the Germans. If you watched Wonder Woman, you would know that, although they weren't being, as stereotypically comic book villain, like cackling maniacally when they made it or anything. Germans are the first ones to use it. They are not the only ones to use it. In fact, Britain uses it, France uses it. Pretty much everybody during World War I is going to end up using poison gas. We tend to retroactively make the Germans the bad guys in World War I. They're really not. In World War II, the Germans are Nazis, so it's pretty easy to say they're the bad guys. In World War I, there really is no bad guy. So a lot of times people are like, oh yeah, the Germans used poison gas. Well, everybody used poison gas. The Germans are just the first ones that made it. So the main gas is going to be used here is going to be a mustard gas, a chlorine gas. And basically what this does is it's gaseous acid, more or less. You breathe it in and it starts disintegrating your insides. It makes it so you can't breathe. It burns your lungs. It burns your throat. If it gets on your skin, it'll burn your skin. It could burn your eyes. It's got huge problems in terms of your body can't handle that, right? This is seen as a solution for trenches because think about how gas functions, right? If you have gas in an area, where is it going to go? Hopefully you don't say float away, because gas doesn't actually float away. Gas has density. It actually settles into the lowest area. The lowest area is going to be a trench. And when that gas goes in there, the people in the trench now have an option. Stay in there with the gas or get out of the trench. And when they get out of the trench, you can shoot at them and kill them. Especially early on, they don't have gas masks like this. Poison gas didn't exist as a weapon until 1915. Why would people have gas masks developed against it, right? So early on, when this is being used, people have no idea how to defend against it. You have to leave that trench, and then you're going to get shot. So what is the effect of this going to be? Again, these are those gas masks. There's a bunch of different versions of them early on as people are trying to figure out the best way to do it. Fun fact about gas masks, by the way. This is not 100% confirmed, but it's mostly confirmed by historical sources. There's a very good chance that the reason why Hitler had the Hitler mustache is because of gas masks. That was actually a fashion thing back then. People had that kind of mustache. Like look at like Charlie Chaplin, for example, had the Hitler stash before it was the Hitler stash because it was a fashion option. But Hitler actually had like a full-on like bushy mustache, but there was a poison gas attack and he couldn't get his gas mask to seal properly because of the mustache. So he shaved off the sides of it and only left the middle, and that's why he had the Hitler stash. Again, not 100% confirmed, but there's a bunch of primary source accounts from the time basically saying that's why he did it. So, it's possible, maybe. Anyway, American soldiers with their gas masks on. The effects of this, as you can see here, so the skin over here has been exposed to gas and it's been burned. That's like the boils right there are results of that burning. That guy's obviously in intense pain right there. So you get skin blistering. You can get internal bleeding and vomiting depending on how much you breathe in. If you breathe in too much, it'll just kill you right away. If you breathe in a moderate amount, you might live through it, but you might also just have like up to 5 weeks of just suffering as your body is continuing to melt away and nobody can really do anything about it because it's the 1910s and they don't really have good technology. And even now we struggle to deal with that. So over the course of about, a month, you just gradually painfully die. If you only breathe in a little bit, you might recover and maybe you'll be good to go. This is classified as a war crime at the end of the war. And I really want to emphasize how bad a weapon has to be classified as a war crime. Nukes, not a war crime. Napalm, which causes 5th degree burns, that is burns down to the bone, not a war crime. Barbed wire, which is used during World War I to horrible effect of people just getting caught and shredded up in there, not a war crime. Poison gas, war crime. So clearly there is a huge mental effect from this, because it's terrifying to the soldiers of the time. There's no way to defend against it early on, and even afterwards you might end up looking like this, even if you did get your gas mask on properly. Artillery is our next one. Again, this is not necessarily made for World War I, but it's definitely developed and expanded during World War I. Artillery is probably what you are familiar with, big giant cannons basically. And this counters trenches because it's relatively new, so people don't have a huge amount of experience countering it, and you put it way, way back behind the trenches. Artillery can fire incredibly far. There is no way that they're going to be able to target your artillery unless they use their own artillery. And if they put their artillery close enough to target your artillery, then it's going to be ahead of their trench lines, and you could attack it and take it out. So your artillery is basically, as long as you don't screw up the positioning of it, untargetable. And you could use it to fire massive shells that are like basically the size of a person, and you bombard the enemy position. So if you're going to attack their trench, right, you don't just want to send your dudes up and over, because that's going to get a lot of people killed. What you want to do is have a couple of hours, just multiple artillery batteries firing down on their trenches, and then you send your guys in. When they're too disorganized and scattered, artillery is not necessarily the most precise of things. It's hard to pinpoint aim it, but when you just barrage them with a bunch of artillery, you're going to take out a big chunk of their stuff anyway, so I mean, you're good to go there. This is also how you get that poison gas over there. You put it in canisters, it fires over, it lands, the canister breaks open. So this is your way to get at their trenches without actually being at their trenches. So what are the effects of this going to be? This, by the way, is not artillery. This is actually a blimp exploding because the gas got hit. I just needed another explosion picture, and I liked it. So now you could attack trenches without risking your own soldiers, although you are going to follow up and risk your soldiers. You can weaken the enemy. You can cause intense fear in the enemy soldiers, because they're never safe now. So at this point, I want you to think for a second about being a soldier in World War I. You're stuck in a trench, which is full of gross, dirty, freezing cold water that you might get trench foot from. You're surrounded by disease and rats. You could be shot at any time. You might be ordered up into no man's land to go attack. There could be poison gas coming in. Artillery can fire at you at any second. You are never, ever safe. There is a mental effect from that called PTSD. PTSD is the idea that it's post-traumatic stress disorder. You have been exposed to such severe stress that it has a permanent effect on you, and it affects the way that you function as a person. Mental disease and things like PTSD were not recognized at the beginning of the 1900s. So what they would sometimes use to describe that is they would talk about somebody as being shell-shocked. And they'd be like, oh yeah, that person was shell-shocked. And what they're describing is like, artillery landed nearby them, and like it really like freaked them out, and they were never really the same after that. They were kind of like weird, they weren't all there. That's the mental effect of this. And a huge number of these soldiers had basically undiagnosed mental illnesses after this, because there was no support or recognition for that from things like this. You are literally never, ever, ever safe. Imagine just living your daily life, not even in a trench, just like at your home, and knowing that literally at any second there's a good chance that an artillery shell would land either in, on, or near your house, and there's nothing you can do about it. That has a really huge impact on the way people feel and think. So I mentioned barbed wire a few times. This is not a fancy technology. Believe it or not, it is actually somewhat new. Barbed wire wasn't really made until like middle of the end of the 1800s. And using it in battle wasn't really a common thing, but you've got trenches. You've got fortified areas, and the enemy's going to attack them every now and then. So what you can do is just put up your barbed wire like this, and that's right in front of your trenches. So they run all the way across no man's land, they get to you, and now what are they going to do? They're going to run into the barbed wire? They're going to cut through it as you're shooting them with machine guns. They're going to crawl under it. Like, what are they going to do? Maybe it can get blown up by the artillery, or they could throw a grenade at it and try to like blow a hole in it. But for the most part, barbed wire is really effective, because not only is it going to just cut them up and really mess them up, even if you decide, like, you know what, screw it, I'm going to deal with the pain and get through that barbed wire, how are you going to run through barbed wire? It's like rope. It ties you up as you go through it, and you get stuck like this guy. So makes it so you're even more fortified. You got all this barbed wire. What's the effect going to be there? Obviously, just more fortification. You could also get really fancy with this and intentionally leave a gap open for people to come into, because like the people, when they're coming in, if they see a gap, they're going to go to that, right? So you intentionally make that, and you make it into a dead zone where you just have multiple machine guns focused right at it, and as people run in there, you just mow them down. This means that soldiers have to rely on things like machine guns, grenades, artillery, all that stuff more. They're also going to have to rely on another new thing, tanks. I want to be really clear here. Tanks are not really a big part of World War I. They're used for the first time during World War I, but it's not until almost the very end of the war. And during World War I, they sucked. Their max speed was 3 miles an hour. For the most part, they could not cross trenches because they couldn't deal with big gaps in the ground. The armor on them was like questionable. Some of them were good. Some of them you could shoot through that armor. It's more the idea of tanks were developed and the impact that's going to have. Because think about tanks now, right? They're massive. So they're developed specifically with the Western Front in mind, getting across no man's land, trying to deal with all of that fire being done there. So the effects of this, no man's land is going to be less dangerous. It allows a little bit more progress to be made. Because I don't want to say that tanks did nothing during World War I, right? Like there is going to be an impact there. You could use them for cover. You can use them to get to the enemy trench. They can go over barbed wire. But it's not like they're changing the way warfare works during World War I. Definitely in the future, when we get to World War II, and we talk about Blitzkrieg with Germany, oh man, will we find out how much tanks and really just mechanized infantry in general has changed warfare. But during World War I, it's more notable that like, hey, look, tanks are a thing now. And they're kind of getting used. Speaking of things that exist during World War I but are not really that huge of a deal, but will be a huge deal later, planes. So for the first time, we got planes being used in warfare. They are primarily being used for scouting and the delivery of bombs. Early planes during World War I didn't even have guns mounted on them because they ran into a problem. They were propeller planes, right? Like they had this propeller on the front here, and they couldn't figure out how to time the shooting of the guns so that it didn't shoot off the propeller. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to be like a fighter with that. Later on, you do start getting fighter aircraft. You get things like, if you've ever heard of like the Red Baron and stuff, you know, the pilot flying over the trenches, shooting everybody down. That eventually happens. There's some dogfighting going on, but air superiority is not really a major factor during World War I. Again, it's the idea of they're being used for the first time, and that's pretty significant. So, you know, you get these nice propeller planes. I, by the way, would not want to be that doesn't look like it should be in the air. That doesn't look like it could deal with like, you know, big gusts of wind very well. I would not feel safe flying in that. That's just me though. I'm terrified of heights, so that's, you know, whatever. This, by the way, I want to point out immediately, not World War I. This is World War II. I'm putting this in here to point out how significant planes become. So the effects of these planes, number one, cavalry is obsolete. I know it sounds really silly to say that at the beginning of the 1900s, but at the start of World War I, about a third of most countries' military was still made up of cavalry units. They were viewed as like the prime form of scouting and offense. That doesn't work with trenches. How are you going to use cavalry to scout with trenches? You're going to die, right? But planes can do that. So now cavalry is completely meaningless. It is completely obsolete. Between planes and tanks, there is nothing that cavalry can do that more modern equipment cannot do. These planes also are going to cause havoc with trenches, you know, when they can actually drop bombs in them. And again, like tanks, the more significant thing is how they're going to affect warfare in the future. By the time we get to World War II, the most significant ship in your fleet is the aircraft carrier. Because if you don't have air superiority, you're screwed. If the enemy has planes and you don't, they have an entire extra dimension of the battle that they get to fight in that you don't get to impact at all. When we look at like bombing runs, right? Pearl Harbor is done by aircraft. The nukes that are dropped on Japan are done by aircraft. Firebombing is done by aircraft. That it is a huge thing. When looking at D-Day, paratroopers are dropped in behind enemy lines by aircraft. So going forward, having an air force and having air technology and superiority is massively important. During World War I, it's more important that planes are being used. They're introducing the idea. What is being used to really good effect during World War I, not necessarily tanks and planes, U-boats. Submarines in general, but U-boats in particular, because those are the submarines that Germany uses, or used. And those U-boats were used by Germany to carry out this thing called unrestricted submarine warfare. And basically they said, any ship entering the war zone is fair game and we will sink it. They're trying to cut off Britain's supplies, basically. This is going to lead to them targeting, American ships, which is a huge factor in why America joins the war. So U-boats are going to be a big effect here. Britain's Navy is going to have to put a lot of focus in defending their supply lines, which means that they don't get to focus entirely on fighting the war. It wasn't a huge naval war anyway, so it wasn't like that's, a make or break point. But remember, Britain's main fighting force is their Navy, and the U-boats basically ensure that it's mostly tied up trying to keep all of this under wraps. This does help Germany hold off Britain because, again, they get to distract their Navy. And it helps bring America into the war because America does not like it when our ships get sunk when we are, trading with people. Next up is snipers. Look at this guy's fashionable hat right there. Just chilling out, looking like a B horror movie main villain dude. Like some kind of budget Texas Chainsaw Massacre stuff going on. Anyway, this is a World War I sniper. Obviously, a sniper is somebody who shoots people from far away. World War I snipers had it especially interesting because basically what they would do is they would wait until like the middle of the night, very early morning when it's like pretty super dark out, and they would sneak out, they would crawl out into no man's land. They would find a place to kind of set up shop and be hidden, maybe using some of this high-tech camouflage like this guy right here. And then they wait. And they look for anybody who's going to poke their head up from the trenches so they could shoot them. This had a lot of effects. Like one of them, for example, it was very dangerous to smoke cigarettes at night in the trenches because a sniper can look for the ember at the end of that cigarette. They could aim a few inches back from it towards your face, and they could shoot you. You could also do things like, obviously this only works a limited number of times before people start realizing what's going on, but they could have the people in their trenches put up a kite in the sky with writing on it, so people kind of look up to see what's written on there, and when they move and they're not really in that, because remember, a lot of those front trenches are not that deep, right? So when they move, it exposes them, the sniper can shoot them. It's another one of those artillery aspects, right? You are like, look how intimidating that guy looks. That's terrifying. Why does he have that face? Oh, I know he has that face mask on to hide his face. But anyway, this adds to that fear, right? You could be killed at almost any time. You could be killed at almost any time by gas, by artillery, and now by snipers as well. It makes life even more miserable. You constantly have to be aware of, is my head poking out above the top of this trench, which might mean that you have to stay hunched down, super cramped muscles for hours and hours and hours at a time because it is dangerous to stick your head up. It also leads to some interesting World War I tactics. This is an actual thing that they did during World War I. They would make papier-mâché heads. And they would stick them on, their bayonet, and then they would stick the head up over the edge of the trench. I mean, that looks like, pretty realistic, especially when you're looking like old school sniper technology. You're not looking at that super close. What you see is a head sticking up. So the sniper then shoots at it. The people in the trench are able to know where the sniper is positioned generally by the position you shot from. And you could have your own counter snipers that are out there in no man's land as well and try to shoot that guy for you, right? So it's a cat and mouse game. By the way, when I do this in class, every year somebody asks me, why do they make paper mache heads? Why don't they just use the heads of like dead soldiers? That always terrifies me. You're telling me you'd be totally okay, your buddy died in the trench next to you, you're just going to saw his head off, put it on a bayonet, and stick it above, like, y'all kids are sociopaths, you're crazy. I don't know if any of you were thinking that this time, but literally every year when we do this in class, there's at least one person that's like, why don't they use real heads? Stop being crazy, guys. We're not going to do that part. Looks like we're in. There used to be a part we did about under trench warfare, but I have forgotten that I took that out. So that is our weapons and tactics stuff. We will continue on our next one. I believe next one is America entering the war. I'll have to double check. Thank you all for listening.